The champagne glasses clinked like wind chimes in a storm, each delicate ring a cruel reminder of what this night was supposed to be. Our 25th anniversary party. Silver balloons bobbed against the ceiling, their metallic sheen catching the light like the promise of a future that now felt like a lie. Michelle stood across the room, her laughter slicing through the hum of conversation like shards of glass. It wasn't her usual laugh, warm, familiar, the one I'd spent decades memorizing. No, this was something else, something sharp, something foreign. I watched her from the edge of the room, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. She was leaning into him, some guy I didn't recognize, tall and too polished, like he'd stepped out of a catalog for expensive cologne. His hand hovered near her elbow, not quite touching, but close enough to make my stomach twist. Michelle's head tilted back, her dark curls spilling over her shoulder, and she laughed again. That laugh. It wasn't just the sound of it that stung. It was the way her eyes sparkled, the way her body angled toward him like a flower turning toward the sun. She hadn't looked at me like that in years. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with the scent of lilies and something faintly sour, like fruit left too long in a bowl. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. Michelle's hand brushed the stranger's arm, and for a split second, her wedding band caught the light. The sight of it, that thin circle of gold I'd slipped onto her finger a lifetime ago, felt like a punch to the gut. 25 years, a quarter of a century, and here we were, in the middle of a room full of friends and family, while she flirted with a man who might as well have been a ghost for all I knew about him. "Timothy!" A voice called, pulling me back. It was Frank, my oldest friend, his face flushed with drink and good cheer. He clapped me on the shoulder, his grip too tight, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. 25 years, buddy. That's something, huh? Yeah, I said, my voice cracking like dry wood. Something. Frank didn't notice. He was too busy refilling his glass, his laughter blending with the noise of the party. But I wasn't listening anymore. My attention was back on Michelle, on the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, on the way she smiled at that man like he held the secret to something she'd been searching for. And then, as if she could feel the weight of my gaze, she glanced over. Our eyes met for a split second, and in that moment, I saw it. The flicker of guilt, quickly masked by a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The knife I'd been holding all night, the one I didn't even realize I was gripping, slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The sound was lost in the noise of the party, but the sting of it lingered, sharp and unforgiving. 25 years. And in the space of a single evening, it all felt like it was unraveling, thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of her laughter. The party was still raging in the other room, the clink of glasses and forced laughter filtering through the walls. But in the dimly lit hallway, the world felt like it had stopped. Jake stood there, his hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets, his face pale under the flickering overhead light. He looked older than his 19 years, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something far heavier than any kid should have to bear. "Dad," he started, his voice cracking like it used to when he was 12 and trying to sound tough. "I need to tell you something." I leaned against the wall, the cool plaster pressing into my back, grounding me. My first thought was that he was in trouble. Maybe he'd totaled the car or failed a class. But the way he was looking at me like he was about to rip something out of his chest and hand it to me told me this was bigger. "Mom's been lying to you," he said, his voice trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. "She's been seeing that guy for months." The words hit me like a sucker punch, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. That guy, the one at the party, the one with the easy laugh and the way he leaned too close to Michelle, his hand brushing her arm like it was an accident. Jake pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his photos. The screen lit up his face, casting shadows that made him look even more haunted. He handed it to me, and there they were, Michelle and that guy. In a coffee shop, her hand resting on his like it belonged there. At a park, their heads close together, her smile brighter than it had been in years. "I didn't want to believe it either," Jake said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "But I saw her last month, when she said she was at her sister's. She was with him, at a hotel." My stomach churned, the bile rising in my throat. I scrolled through more photos, each one a dagger twisting deeper into my gut. There were receipts too, expensive dinners, spa days, charges at places I'd never heard of. And then there were the bank statements, withdrawals that didn't add up, cash disappearing like smoke. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jake whispered, his eyes glistening. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to wreck everything. But I couldn't keep it from you anymore." I handed the phone back to him, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. I wanted to scream, to break something, to march back into that party and drag Michelle out by her hair. But instead, I just stood there, the weight of Jake's words pressing down on me like a boulder. "You did the right thing," I said finally, my voice rough. I don't know what to do with this." Jake nodded, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've got more," he said, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "Stuff I printed out. Bank stuff. Texts. I don't know if it helps, but..." I took the envelope, the paper rough against my fingers. Inside were more receipts, more evidence of a life Michelle had been living in secret. A life I hadn't even known existed. The sound of laughter drifted down the hallway, Michelle's voice rising above the rest. She sounded happy, carefree, like she didn't have a care in the world. I looked at Jake, his face a mirror of my own pain and confusion. "We'll figure this out," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. "But for now, let's just get through tonight." He nodded, shoving his hands back in his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be," I said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't on you." We stood there for a moment, the noise of the party a distant hum, the weight of what we both knew hanging heavy between us. And then, with a deep breath, I followed Jake back into the fray, my heart pounding like a drum, the envelope burning a hole in my pocket. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, a sound that had always been there but only now felt oppressive. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals, birthdays, and late-night conversations. Tonight it felt foreign, like a relic from someone else's life. The bowl of oranges in the center had started to rot, their skins puckered and dimpled, a sickly sweet smell wafting up. I couldn't bring myself to throw them out. They felt like a metaphor for something I couldn't quite name. Michelle walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She didn't look at me, just poured herself a glass of wine, the deep red liquid sloshing against the sides of the glass. I watched her, the way she moved with such practiced ease, as if nothing was wrong, as if our entire world wasn't teetering on the edge of collapse. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Surprised me. I'd been rehearsing this moment in my head for days, imagining the words I'd say, the way she'd react. But now that it was here, it all felt wrong, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "About what?" she asked, taking a slow sip of her wine. "About him," I said, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "About Jake. About us." She set her glass down with deliberate care, the clink of it against the countertop sharp and final. "Timothy," she began, her voice calm, almost pitying. "You've never really understood me. It wasn't what I expected." I'd braced myself for denial, for tears, for excuses. But this cold, calculated dismissal cut deeper than anything else could have. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, like she'd been waiting for this moment, like she'd already rehearsed it in her head 1,000 times. "What does that even mean?" I asked, my voice rising despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "That I didn't understand you? So that gives you the right to what?" She interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "To find someone who actually sees me? Who doesn't just go through the motions day after day, like we're some kind of scripted sitcom." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "Is that what you think this has been? A script? A performance?" She didn't answer right away, just turned to look out the window, where the rain had started to fall, tapping softly against the glass. It felt like the universe was mocking me, the steady rhythm of it somehow too gentle for the storm raging inside me. "You've been so passive," she said finally, her voice softer now but no less cutting. "Like you're just waiting for life to happen to you. I needed more than that. I needed someone who wanted me, not just tolerated me." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Tolerated her? How could she think that? After everything we built, after all the years, the sacrifices, the moments that had felt so real, so alive, how could she reduce it all to that? And him? I asked, my voice shaking now. He's what you needed? Some guy who swoops in with empty words and cheap gestures. She turned back to me, her eyes flashing. At least he tries. At least he makes me feel like I matter. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to shake her until she saw how wrong she was. But instead, I just sat there, my hands clenched into fists under the table, the smell of those rotting oranges filling my nose. So that's it, I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. You're just done. She didn't answer right away, just picked up her wine glass and took another sip. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost detached. I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time. Maybe it's better if we just accept that. I wanted to argue, to fight, to tell her she was wrong. But the truth was I didn't know how. The weight of her words, of everything that had happened, pressed down on me until it felt like I couldn't breathe. And as I sat there, watching her walk out of the kitchen without a backward glance, I realized that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Our marriage wasn't just crumbling. It was already gone. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums, like the air itself is holding its breath. I sat in the living room, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the walls. The TV was off, the clock on the mantel ticked like a metronome, and I just sat there, staring at the empty space where Michelle used to sit. Her favorite chair, the one she'd curl up in with her book and a glass of wine, now looked like a relic from someone else's life. A life I didn't recognize anymore. My mind kept circling back to the signs. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in self-care weekends, the way she'd started dressing differently, like she was trying to impress someone. But it wasn't me. It was never me. I chalked it up to stress, to midlife restlessness, to anything but the truth. Because the truth was too ugly, too sharp, like a shard of glass I couldn't pull out of my chest. I thought about the vacations we'd taken, the birthdays, the anniversaries. Were they all lies? Was she thinking about him when we stood on that beach in Hawaii, watching the sunset? When we danced at Jake's wedding, her head resting on my shoulder, was she already planning her next rendezvous? The memories felt tainted now, like someone had spilled ink over a photo album, blurring everything into a mess of what-ifs and why-didn't-I-sees. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. It used to make me smile, that scent. Now it just made me sick. I could almost hear her laughter, the way it used to fill the room, bright and loud and alive. But now it echoed in my head like a taunt, a reminder of how easily she'd slipped away from me. I got up and walked to the kitchen, my feet dragging against the hardwood floor. The fridge hummed softly, and I opened it, staring at the shelves like they might hold some kind of answer. A half-empty bottle of white wine, leftovers from a meal we'd shared a week ago, a carton of eggs with the expiration date stamped in bold. None of it made sense anymore. None of it felt real. I grabbed the wine and poured myself a glass. Not because I wanted it, but because it felt like something to do. The first sip was bitter, but I kept drinking, letting the cold liquid numb the edges of my thoughts. My phone buzzed on the counter, and for a second, I thought it might be her. Maybe she'd call to explain, to apologize, to say it was all a mistake. But it was just a notification from the bank. Another reminder of the life we'd built together, now crumbling under the weight of her betrayal. I sat back down, the glass in my hand, and stared at the shadows on the wall. They shifted and danced, twisting into shapes I couldn't quite make out. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp and insistent, and I felt a sudden, irrational anger rise in my chest. Not at the dog, not even at Michelle, but at myself. For being blind, for being trusting, for letting her make a fool of me. The weight of it all pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to tear the house apart until there was nothing left but the bones of what it used to be. But I didn't. I just sat there, in the dark, holding on to the pieces of a life that didn't exist anymore. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. The morning light sliced through the blinds like a blade, cutting across the chaos of my mind. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee I hadn't touched, my hands trembling with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The house felt hollow, like the shell of the life I thought I had. Michelle's perfume still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the lies she'd spun. But I wasn't going to let that scent, or her, haunt me anymore. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows on my face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I started digging. Emails, bank statements, credit card bills. Every piece of paper I could find became a weapon in this war I hadn't asked for but was determined to win. The numbers didn't lie. Trips she'd claimed were for work conferences, lined up perfectly with withdrawals from our joint account. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, even a goddamn spa day. All while I was at home, working late to keep the lights on and the fridge stocked. I felt the anger rise in my chest, hot and sharp, but I forced it down. This wasn't about rage. It was about survival. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at a name I hadn't thought I'd need. David, attorney at law, a buddy from college who'd gone into family law. He'd always been the kind of guy who could cut through the bullshit, and right now that's exactly what I needed. When I called him, his voice was calm, professional. "Tim, it's been a while. What's going on?" I hesitated for a second, the shame of it all threatening to choke me, but I pushed through. "Michelle's been seeing someone else. For months. Maybe longer. I need to know my options." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of a pen clicking. "Okay," he said. "We'll need to document everything. Financial records, any proof of infidelity, anything that shows she's been dishonest. The more you have, the stronger your case." I hung up and stared at the screen again, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. It was time to stop being the guy who turned a blind eye, the guy who made excuses for her. I was done being her pawn. This wasn't just about the money or the house or even Jake, though God knows he was my priority. This was about reclaiming the life she'd stolen from me, piece by piece, lie by lie. I grabbed a notebook and started jotting down dates, times, anything I could remember. The night she came home late, smelling like someone else's cologne. The weekends she'd spend visiting her sister, but never answered her phone. The way she'd started dressing differently, laughing at jokes I didn't get, pulling away from me in ways I couldn't articulate until now. It was all there, staring back at me in black and white. By the time the sun was high in the sky, I had a stack of papers and a fire in my gut. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her rewrite our story. This was my life, my family, and I wasn't going to let her take it without a fight. The next step was clear. I needed to talk to Jake. He deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered the image he had of his mother. But first, I needed to make sure I was ready. Ready to face him, ready to face her, ready to face whatever came next. I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve steady. The coffee had gone cold, but I didn't care. I poured it down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl and disappear. It felt symbolic, like I was washing away the old version of myself, the one who'd been too blind, too trusting, too weak. That guy was gone. And this new version? He wasn't going down without a fight. The days blurred together after the confrontation. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers Jake had handed me, the ones I hadn't been able to bring myself to look at yet. The house felt hollow, like the walls were closing in, but also too big, too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like her footsteps, every gust of wind against the windows like her voice trying to worm its way back in. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. It was Jake who finally snapped me out of it. He came home from school one afternoon, tossed his backpack on the couch and said, "Dad, you've got to stop moping. She's not worth it." He was right, of course. But it wasn't just about her. It was about the life I thought we'd built, the future I'd been so sure of. It was about the fact that I'd been blind, willfully, stupidly blind, to what was happening right under my nose. So I started digging. It began with the credit card statements. Michelle had always been the one to handle the finances, claiming it was easier for her to keep track of everything. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? But now, as I flipped through the pages of charges, I noticed patterns I'd never seen before. Hotel rooms in cities she'd never mentioned visiting. Restaurants I'd never heard of. Charges for lingerie stores and florists. Things she hadn't bought for me in years. Then there were the withdrawals. Large sums of cash, always just under the amount that would trigger a bank alert. Always on Fridays, the day she'd supposedly be heading out of town for her business trips. I'd never questioned it. She'd always been so convincing, so detailed in her explanations. "The conference is in Chicago this time," she'd say, or, "I've got a client meeting in Denver." And I'd believed her, every single time. But the real kicker came when I found the secret account. It was buried deep in the files on her laptop, which she'd left behind in her rush to move out. A separate checking account, untouched by our joint finances, funded entirely by those business trips. The deposits were regular, always matching the cash withdrawals from our main account. It was like she'd been funneling money out of our marriage, dollar by dollar, for years. I sat there, staring at the screen, the numbers swimming in front of my eyes. It wasn't just the money. It was the planning, the deliberation. She hadn't just fallen into this affair. She'd built it, brick by brick, while I'd been too busy playing the dutiful husband to notice. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when I saw the name on the account. Not Michelle's name, not mine. His, the man from the party, the one with the too perfect smile and the too loud laugh. The one who'd been sitting at our dinner table, drinking my wine, eating my food, while my wife sat beside him, her hand brushing his under the table. I felt sick, not just because of the betrayal, but because of how obvious it all seemed now. The late nights, the sudden interest in self-care and personal growth. The way she'd started dressing differently, wearing clothes that were a little too tight, a little too young for her. I chalked it up to midlife crisis, to her trying to reclaim some part of herself she felt she'd lost. But it wasn't about her. It was about him, about them, about the life they'd been building together, right under my nose. I printed out everything, the statements, the account details, the emails I found buried in her inbox. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I needed it. Needed something solid, something real to hold on to. Because the truth was, I still loved her. Or maybe I just loved the idea of her, the woman I thought she was. And that was the hardest part. Realizing that woman had never really existed. As I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of her lies, I felt something shift inside me. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief. They were still there, but they were quieter now, tempered by a strange, almost clinical detachment. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about Jake, about the life we were going to build without her. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The courtroom was sterile, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead like insects trapped in a jar. Michelle sat across the aisle, her lawyer whispering something urgent into her ear. She looked different. The woman I'd married, the one who used to laugh at my dumb jokes and cry during sappy movies, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized. A stranger with a sharp jawline and a cold, calculated stare. She wore a tailored suit, her nails freshly manicured, and her hair styled to perfection. It was armor, and I knew she thought it made her untouchable. But the cracks were starting to show. I sat there, fidgeting with my tie, a relic from our wedding day that I dug out of the back of my closet. Felt like a sick joke, wearing it now. Jake was next to me, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He'd insisted on coming, despite my protests. "I need to see this, Dad," he'd said. His voice steady but his eyes betraying the storm inside him. I didn't argue. He deserved to see the truth, even if it hurt. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a voice that could cut glass, began reading her verdict. Michelle's smirk, that damn smirk she'd been wearing since the first day of the trial, started to waver. The lawyer's whispers grew frantic, but it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. The photos Jake had taken, the bank statements, the hotel receipts. All of it painted a picture of betrayal so deep it still made my stomach churn. "Full custody is awarded to the father," the judge declared, her tone final. Michelle's face went pale, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned to glare at me. I expected anger, maybe even tears, but what I saw was something worse. Defeat. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow expression that made her look small. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The rest of the verdict was a blur. Assets divided, alimony denied, and a restraining order slapped on her new friend. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was numb. Jake squeezed my arm, his way of saying, "We did it, Dad." And we had. But it didn't feel like winning. Felt like surviving. As we left the courtroom, Michelle tried to catch my eye. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I focused on the weight of Jake's hand on my shoulder, the sound of his breathing, steady and calm beside me. Outside, the sun was blinding, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I took a deep breath, letting the crispness of it fill my lungs. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But as we walked to the car, I caught a glimpse of Michelle in the rearview mirror. She was standing on the courthouse steps, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of rage and regret. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For both of us. The community center parking lot was half empty when I pulled in, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. I hadn't planned on coming, hadn't even known about the charity bake sale until Jake mentioned it. But something tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the need to see the fallout with my own eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt sugar and desperation. Michelle stood behind a table piled high with cookies and cupcakes, her smile so wide it looked like it might crack her face in two. She was wearing that teal blouse I'd bought her last Christmas. The one she said made her feel seen. Now it just made her look like she was trying too hard. A few people lingered near her table, but their body language said everything. Arms crossed, heads tilted slightly away, polite nods that didn't quite reach their eyes. Our old neighbor, Carol, picked up a cookie, inspected it like it might be poisoned, and set it back down without a word. Michelle's laugh, a high, brittle sound, echoed through the room as she tried to make small talk, but the words fell flat. I leaned against the wall near the punch bowl, unnoticed. Watching her was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Part of me wanted to look away, but another part, the part that still carried the weight of her lies, needed to see this, needed to know that the truth had consequences. She caught my eye then, and for a moment her mask slipped. The smile faltered, and something raw flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same artificial cheer. She turned back to the table, rearranging cookies with trembling hands. I thought about walking over, saying something cutting, something that would cut through her facade like a knife. But what was the point? The damage was done. The whispers had already started, the sideways glances, the quiet judgments. Our friends, her friends, were pulling away, one by one, like they'd finally seen the cracks in the perfect life she'd built. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Jake across the room, helping a little kid pick out a cupcake. He looked good, better than he had in months. Stronger. It hit me then, like a punch to the gut. Michelle wasn't just losing me. She was losing him, too. And for all her lies, all her schemes, that was the one thing she couldn't spin. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Pity and satisfaction warred in my chest, a toxic cocktail I couldn't quite swallow. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them. But as I got into my truck and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not for her. Not for me. Just another chapter in a story I hadn't asked to be part of. The tent was too small for two grown men, but Jake insisted we share it. "Like old times, Dad," he said, his voice cracking just enough to let me know he was trying too hard. I didn't argue. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of bug spray. It was the first time in months I'd felt anything close to peace. We'd driven 5 hours to get here, the silence between us heavy but not hostile. Jake had plugged his phone into the car stereo, playing songs I didn't recognize but pretended to like. Every now and then, he'd glance at me, his eyes searching for something. Approval, maybe, or just a sign that I wasn't about to fall apart. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, but inside, I was scrambling. How do you rebuild a bond with your son when you've spent the last year barely holding yourself together? The first night, we built a fire that was more smoke than flame. Jake laughed when I cursed at the wet wood, and for a moment it felt like we were back to how things used to be. Before the lies, before the divorce, before everything went to hell. We roasted hot dogs that burned on the outside and stayed cold in the middle, and when Jake handed me one with a grin, I realized how much I'd missed this. Not just the camping, but the easy, unspoken understanding between us. Later, as the fire died down to embers, Jake started talking. Not about Michelle or the divorce, but about school, his friends, the things he wanted to do after graduation. I listened, really listened, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a rawness in his voice, a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. It hit me then like a punch to the gut, how much he'd been carrying on his own. I'd been so wrapped up in my own pain that I hadn't seen his. "I'm sorry," I said, the words catching in my throat. "For everything. I should have been there more." Jake didn't say anything at first. He just stared into the fire, his face shadowed and unreadable. Then quietly he said, "I know you were trying, Dad. It's been hard." We sat there for what felt like hours, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. At some point, I reached over and squeezed his shoulder, the way I used to when he was a kid. He didn't pull away. The next morning, we hiked to a lookout point Jake had found online. The trail was steeper than either of us had anticipated, and by the time we reached the top, we were both sweating and out of breath. But the view was worth it. The valley stretched out below us, bathed in early morning light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something other than anger or sadness. It wasn't joy exactly, but something closer to hope. Jake stood beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You think Mom's okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for him. The truth was, I didn't know. Michelle had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. But standing there, with the wind in my face and my son by my side, I realized I didn't need to have all the answers. We were figuring it out one step at a time. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think she'll be okay. And so will we." Jake nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Yeah," he said. "We will." We stayed there for a while, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. It wasn't a perfect moment. There were still too many scars, too many unspoken words, but it was a start, and sometimes that's enough. The air up here was different, thin, sharp, and clean in a way that seemed to cut through the fog of the last year. Jake was a few paces behind me, fiddling with the straps on his backpack, but I could hear his breathing, steady and strong. The trail had been brutal, especially for a kid who'd spent most of his teenage years glued to a screen, but he hadn't complained once. Not when the rocks bit into his palms, not when the wind howled like it was trying to push us back down. He just kept climbing, his jaw set in that stubborn way that reminded me so much of his mother, or at least the version of her I thought I'd married. I stepped onto the summit and the world opened up. The mountains stretched out in every direction, their peaks softened by the late afternoon light. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, its wings catching the sun in flashes of gold. I'd seen this view before, years ago, back when Michelle and I were still trying to make it work. Back when I thought love was something you could fix with enough effort, like a leaky faucet or a squeaky door. Standing here now, it felt like I was looking at a completely different world. Or maybe it was me who was different. Jake joined me at the edge, his face flushed from the climb. "We made it," he said, his voice quiet but proud. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The weight of everything we'd been through pressed against my chest. But for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't crush me. It just was, like the rocks beneath our feet, solid and unmovable. I thought about the nights I'd spent alone in the dark, replaying every argument, every lie, every moment I'd missed the signs. I thought about the way Michelle's voice had sounded when she told me I'd never understood her, like she was carving the words into my skin with a knife. I thought about the bank statements, the secret trips, the way she'd looked at me in court, like I was the one who'd betrayed her. And then I thought about Jake, sitting in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive up here, telling me about his new girlfriend, his plans for college, the way he'd started to smile again. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of pine and something else, something wild and untamed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with it, and let it out slowly. The hawk dipped lower, its shadow skimming across the rocks before disappearing into the trees. For a moment, everything felt still, like the world was holding its breath. "You okay, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to him, surprised to see the concern in his eyes. He'd grown so much in the last year, not just physically but in ways I couldn't quite put into words. He was stronger now, more sure of himself. And maybe, just maybe, I was too. Yeah, I said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. I'm okay. He nodded, his gaze shifting back to the horizon. It's pretty up here. It is, I agreed. But it wasn't just the view that felt beautiful. It was the quiet, the stillness, the way the world seemed to stretch out in front of us, full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine a year ago. The shadows of the past were still there, lurking at the edges of my mind, but they didn't feel as heavy anymore. They were just part of the landscape, like the rocks and the trees and the distant peaks. We stood there for a while, not saying much, just breathing in the thin mountain air. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I felt something shift inside me. A kind of lightness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter. A sense of peace, maybe. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that, no matter what happened next, Jake and I would be okay. As we started the climb back down, the wind at our backs, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The hawk was gone, but the mountains were still there, solid and unyielding, like they'd been there for centuries and would be there for centuries more. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be that way too. Not perfect, not unbroken, but steady, strong, ready for whatever came next.